Some basic information that I would like you guys to have before you walk into the classroom. So right now you are looking at the Wacom tablet right here, properties, and you're looking at a digital pen. I am told that the cage is no longer loaning them. So you will need to get a hold of a pen one way or the other. And if you are in the classroom, of course, we have Cintiqs. If you are in Zoom, you will need a Cintiq or some sort of tablet to work with. You will not be using a mouse in this class. So right now you can see on my screen, these are the properties for a Wacom or Wacom, depending on how you like to say it, pen right here. And I'm looking at the default settings. So you can see that we've got the buttons right here that you click on the pen. One by default is set up for a double click. One is set as a right click, and the tip of the pen itself is the left click. All right, so the thing you need to understand before we even start ZBrush is that this double click right here is useless for you. In fact, it can cause you a lot of problems. The only thing you need in ZBrush is a right click and a left click, which is right there on the tip. So for me, I set up my pen this way. Now you can set it up any way you want. Just understand that all you need is a right click and a left click. But for me, I like to go in here, and the very last button right here, I make that a right click. And for other software that I'm used to working in, I like to have a middle click. You don't need a middle click in ZBrush, but this is the way I set up my pen. Like I said, however you want to do it, totally up to you. Just know that you only need a right click and a left click, and you absolutely do not need that double click. So just make sure you get rid of that and you'll be okay. All right, so now that you have your pen set up, you're going to double click the ZBrush icon. If you're working in Monty, you can go down to the search box and just type in Z or ZB, and you should see ZBrush pop up. I'm working right now in ZBrush 2021.7. I'm on my computer at home. In Monty right now, you guys have 2021.6. They are almost exactly the same. There's just a couple of new things that they put into this update, but there's only a couple of months difference in these updates. All right, so when you click on the icon, and by the way, I'm starting at the very, very beginning. Okay, so if any of you guys are nervous that you've never worked in ZBrush before, don't worry. I'm starting at the very beginning, and that's exactly what this pre-quarter lecture is all about. So what I want to do is just kind of give you a tour and show you some really basic stuff in ZBrush, so that on day one, when we get to class, I can start lecturing on sculpting, and you'll already kind of know your way around ZBrush at least a little bit. Now, also, some things that you will find in your Dropbox. If you look in the materials folder in the Dropbox, you will see that I've given you a number of documents, but and we'll talk about some of these on the first day of class. But while I have you here, one of the first things that I want you to be aware of is I have given you guys a study guide. It's a PDF. It's inside the Dropbox materials folder. And in here, I have given you guys, I break it down for basically every few days of class. So classes 1 through 3, all of the topics that I cover. There are links here. So throughout the quarter, you know, obviously you're going to be using Google and all of that stuff. I'm just always worried that when you use Google, you might come across bad information because there's a lot of it out there. So the information that I put on the study guide is stuff that I absolutely know is good information. So whenever I'm covering topics, not only will there be class recordings, you will also have this study guide that will help you a whole bunch. So I just wanted to point that out. We'll talk about some other things in class. So why don't we just jump right into this? So when you first open ZBrush, this is what it looks like, right? And you get this window right here, and this window takes you to the ZBrush website, where There's a ton of great videos, tutorials. Also, they're trying to sell you the software. Now, be aware, as a student at SCAD, there's a few ways. First of all, you've got ZBrush in Monty on every computer. So if you need to access ZBrush, you can access it there. You can also access the VLab. And if you look inside the, also in the Dropbox are some instructions for how you log into the VLab. So basically what that is you are given access from your home to use Monty's computers. I believe there's also a new thing you have to do is when you're logging in, basically you have to send me an email and I plug your name into this menu that I have in my SCAD, and that way you can have access to it. So if you think you need the VLab, follow the instructions and send me your email, and I can plug your email into the system and get you hooked up to VLab. Another thing is simply you can go to pixelogic.com. You can either buy the software straight up, and if you do, make sure that you buy the academic version because it's half price. It's about $450 or something like that. The regular price is $900 and something. Both versions are exactly the same. So the academic version and the full version exactly the same. So you might as well buy the academic version if you're planning to buy it. If you are planning to buy it, do not buy the ZBrush Core. You'll only be disappointed. It's a really, really stripped down version of ZBrush, and does not have a fraction of the tools that we will be using in this class. So just be aware of that. Also, if you just want to have your own version of ZBrush while you're taking it this quarter, on pixelogic.com, they do have subscriptions. I think it's $40 a month. So, you know, you could subscribe to it for the 3 months of this quarter and you'll be good to go. All right, so I have opened up ZBrush, and here's this window I was just talking about. You can click anywhere on here and it will take you to pixelogic.com. We don't need that, so I'm going to click this X right here and get rid of it. Now, the next thing you'll be looking at is all of this right here. This is called the Lightbox, okay? Now, the Lightbox, if you look right here, you can see that it has a ton of menus. There's a lot of different things that you can get to and use through the Lightbox. We don't need this right now. So there's two things you can do. You can go right here to the Lightbox button and click it and get rid of it, or click it and bring it back. I'm a big fan of hotkeys, and a lot of, while I'm lecturing this quarter, you will hear me call out the hotkeys all the time. If you are just starting brand new to ZBrush, but you plan on being a pipeline artist, the best thing you can do for yourself is right now start teaching yourself the hotkeys. Okay, so in our case, for this Lightbox right here, I will press comma on my keyboard and get rid of the Lightbox. All right, so now we're looking at this space right here. So this space that we'll be working in is called the canvas. All right, and I'd like to get started working. So if you look over here to your right, we have the tool menu. And right here are these two little arrows. You can double click and you can close that, double click and open it. So this space right here is called a tray. If I look over here to the left, I have another tray right here. There's also a tray at the bottom. I can double click right there. All right. Inside this right tray is the tool menu. All right, so this is where we start setting up files and where most of our menus will be once we get started. Before we do get started, let me just point out that you have a lot of menus right here at the top, and you have this menu over here in the right tray. So this is the tool menu, and if you look right here, you'll notice that there's also, it says tool menu right here. So I can open this up, and this is the same thing that was over here. You see that? So if this can happen on accident, you've got a little button right here that you can hover over, and if I wanted to get this menu out of my tray, I could drag it over into the canvas and just drop it and it's gone. You might accidentally do that one day. If you do, just know that you haven't lost it. All of your menus are always at the top over here. So I could open up the tool menu, hover over that little button and drag this back over to the tray and just put it right back. All right, so first thing we do, we want to get started in ZBrush and start navigating around this UI. You'll notice right off the bat that ZBrush has a pretty complicated UI, and it's going to be tricky at first, all right? And the first couple of weeks, of this class, you're going to be stumbling around this UI. There's just no way around it. You know, you just have to use it a lot. And the more you use it, the more comfortable you're going to get. You will be frustrated the first couple of weeks of this class, but I promise you, just hang in there. And usually by about week 3, most of my students are pretty comfortable and everything will start to make sense by that point. Now, over here in the tool menu, you've got this cylinder sitting right here, and you've got this thing that says Simple Brush, and then you've got this big gold S right here that says Tool right there. It also says Simple Brush. If I wanted to start with a cylinder, I could just click that. But if I click on this gold S, it opens up, and I have this menu right here that says 3D meshes. So you'll see that we have a number of primitives right here. We also down here have this thing called 2.5D brushes. Now, what this is early in ZBrush's days, it was a painting software. It started out as a painting software, and it had all of these kind of almost 3D tools. Like, they weren't quite 3D, but they looked 3D. And so they called those 2.5D. And so a lot of all of these tools right here are throwbacks to a very early version of ZBrush. What you'll find is, as you learn this software, is that from the very first day ZBrush was invented, they have never thrown anything away. Every time there's a new update and you get new things in ZBrush, that's great, but they never get rid of any old tools. And so everything is here. So we've got all of this stuff right here is kind of throwback stuff that we will not touch any of this stuff this quarter. But if you are, I don't know, an illustrator or a painter or something like that, it might be in your interest to Google this stuff and look into these tools. There's some really interesting painting and other stuff that's in this software. But we're focused on this up here. So we've got these primitives, right? And if I want to start working with a primitive, I can just click on any one of these that I might want. I think I'll just grab a cube. So the first thing I'll do is I'll click on the cube, and then I'm going to click right here anywhere on the canvas. So what I'm doing that you can't see is I have my pen hovering over my tablet. In your case, it's either going to be a tablet or a Cintiq, but I'm just hovering over it. I'm not actually touching it. Now, when I want to drag out this cube that I've selected, I will touch my pen to the tablet. I'll touch it and I'll drag, and then I'll pick my pen up again. So now I'm just hovering once again. Now, right up here is a button called Edit. Now, I can't do anything with this cube until I click that button, Edit. In fact, I could keep dragging out stuff, that same cube, over and over. And even though it looks kind of like they're in 3D, this is sort of that 2.5D stuff that I was mentioning earlier. These are all just images. None of this is actually really 3D yet. And so now I have a whole bunch of these. And you know, the last one that I dragged on is actually the model that I would end up working on if I went up here and clicked Edit and then started moving something. So there's the model, but you see it's behind all of that stuff right there, and I can't see it. So this will happen to you. These are just accidental screenshots, basically. And if I ever do this on accident and I need to get rid of these, I'm going to hit Control N as in Nancy, Control N, and that gets rid of those. All right, so now I have this cube. All right, so right now with this cube right here in the canvas, we are in what ZBrush calls the initialize stage. So you drag out any sort of primitive, you click Edit, which by the way, you could also press T as in Tom on your keyboard. That turns the Edit button on and off. And we can sculpt on this if we wanted to, but we're lacking a lot of the tools that ZBrush has because this has not been fully initialized. And so if I want to fully initialize it, look over here, you see the number of menus that I have right here. I don't know, 12 or 15 menus maybe. And then right here I have, it says Make Polymesh 3D. And you see that right now, here's my cube that I'm working with. It says Cube 3D. Anything that is 3D has not yet been initialized, and you really don't want to work on it yet. But as soon as I click Make Polymesh 3D, when I click that, now it creates a new file, and this file is called PM3D. That means Polymesh 3D. And notice my menus here. I got like almost twice as many menus over to the right here. So this is how I know that this thing has now been initialized and it's ready to start sculpting on, okay? Now, I don't know why ZBrush does that. I don't understand the point behind it, but it doesn't matter, all right? We just need to make sure that everything we want to sculpt on, that we want to begin working on, is a PM3D, and that we have all of these extra menus over here under the tool menu. Now, most of the time, you're going to drag this cube out, you're going to click edit, and then you'll come over here and click make poly mesh. You'll do it just like that, and then you'll start working, okay? But sometimes you might have a very specific thing that you need in this primitive. You know, in Maya, you've got tools where you would adjust the horizontal and the vertical edge loops and the size, scale, and stuff like that of your primitive. We have the same thing in ZBrush, and we would do that in the initialize phase. So if I go back to this cube 3D and I click on it, so notice if I click on PM3D, I have all of these menus right here. If I go back to cube 3D right here, I have half as many menus. And also, you know, while we're here, notice that I'm clicking on this, then I'm clicking on this. So these are simply different files right here. In ZBrush, we can work on multiple files at once. And these files are called ztools. Okay, so right now we have 4 ztools working up here. Now this cube 3D, so I went back to it because I want to show you something. So you can either, well, let's pretend that we just opened ZBrush, we dragged out this cube, we hit edit, but we haven't yet hit make polymesh 3D. So this is just a cube 3D, all right? I'm gonna go in this row of buttons right here. So right down to this, there's a button called Poly F. When I click on it, now you can see this cube's wireframes. And in ZBrush, these are called polyframes. So you may hear me say wireframes, you may hear me say polyframes. Both words are interchangeable. But now, while we're in this initialize phase and we haven't yet hit make polymesh 3D, I can go down here to this initialize menu and open this up. And these are very similar tools that you would see in Maya. If you look at my wireframe, I can adjust the horizontal wireframes, I can adjust the vertical. I can actually go in here and play with the size of this. I can also add extra sides to that cube and start making it something else. All right, so I can do all kinds of stuff, all kinds of things to adjust the shape of this primitive before I even start sculpting, all right? Now, like I said, rarely, most of the time you're not going to do this. Most of the time you're going to drag out a cube, hit edit, hit make polymesh and start working. But every now and then you might have something very specific that you need in your primitive. And if so, before you hit make polymesh, you'll go down here to the initialize sub-menu is actually what these are called, sub-menus. And you can make adjustments. Now, depending on what primitive I selected, I'm going to have different sliders here. Like if I go back up here and I grab something like a cone, well, that has, you'll see that this has different sliders that do different things. Let's see, there's an inner and an outer. We could grab anything we want. Let's try a helix. So if I grab a helix, you can see that there are definitely very different types of tools here to adjust a helix. All right. Now, once you have the shape that you want and you've adjusted these things, then you can go up here and hit make polymesh and you get all of these menus. And now we have something, you can see that it changed colors. This is actually the way we want it to be before we start sculpting. We want it to be a make polymesh. You might also notice that now that this is a PM3D, if I go back down here to this initialize submenu again, all of the buttons in here have completely changed. So if I were to grab something that says 3D on it, like cone 3D, you can see that I have all of these sliders and things that we were just talking about, right? But if I go to something that says PM3D, it completely changes. Once I make it a polymesh, this changes. And so you'll see that it says Q cube, Q sphere, Q grid, and then I have Q cylinder, X, Y, and Z, depending on which way I want it oriented. So the Q stands for quadratic. So if I want, like you see this cube right here, this is the default ZBrush cube. It's got this kind of pie wedge thing here on top. I can't stand it. I hate working with that. If I want a regular looking cube, a quadratic cube that I'm used to seeing maybe in Maya, I can hit Q cube. If I click that, now I have a regular looking cube. And by the way, the resolution of this cube is based on what you see in these sliders right here. So it's set to 2 right now. So it's going to be 2 quads on all axes. If I wanted to have more resolution, I could go down here and type in a different number. So I might type in something like this, hit Q cube, and now I have something like that. All right, so you can do this after you've made a poly mesh and you want to work with this. Now you'll see like a Q sphere. So this is not the type of sphere you're used to seeing maybe in Maya or something, because you're used to seeing a pole at the top and the bottom, but this is a quadratic sphere. So basically you take a cube and kind of blow it up and you can make it into a sphere, and it will be quad based like this is. We've got the cube grid, which is just a flat plane, and then we've got the cylinder, which is also quadratic. It doesn't have a pie wedge kind of thing at the top here like you're probably used to seeing. And depending on which one of these buttons I click, that orients the cylinder on the X, Y, or Z axis. I'm going to go back to the cube. All right, so I've got this. Now, while I'm in here, let's talk very quickly just about how to move around within the canvas here. And there's multiple ways to do it. In fact, what you'll find lots of times is that, man, on just about anything you do in ZBrush, there's at least 3 ways to do it most of the time. There's several ways just to move around in here. What you can do, and this depends on if you prefer touching your pen to the tablet or if you like to kind of hover your pen above the tablet. I like to hover my pen above the tablet. I don't know if it's just the way I learned to do it or if it's, at this point, I have no idea but why I do it that way, but it's just preferred by me. So if I wanted to just pan around right here, here's how I do it. By the way, I'm holding my pen in my right hand. I'm right-handed, and my left hand is on my keyboard. And specifically, my hand is on the Control, Shift, and Alt buttons. And I keep 3 fingers on those buttons at all times because most of what you do in ZBrush, you're going to be doing combinations of those buttons all the time. And so I just keep my hand there. So right now I'm holding Alt with my left hand, and I am right-clicking my pen with my right hand, and I'm not touching the tablet. I'm hovering above the tablet, and I can pan around like this. I can hold Control, right-click, still hovering above the tablet, and move my pen up and down, and I can zoom in and out. I can also simply just touch my pen to my tablet anywhere out in the canvas space. Just touch my tablet without pressing any buttons, and I can rotate this. Now you can see up here, there's this little guy. You can customize this. This is an old photogrammetry model of me. You'll see when we get in the classroom, I have a beard now, so I actually don't look like this anymore. I just thought this would be funny to have a picture of me there. You'll have a different picture of something. In fact, you could go into the, let me open up this tray right here. I'm gonna open up preferences and I'm gonna drag this over, and down in here you have something called Cam View, and you've got Next. And if you look at this guy right here, if I hit Next, you can cycle through just whatever pleases you over here. So there's a lot of default things you can put right up there. And this is basically telling you how your model is oriented. That's one way to figure it out. And if you Google it, there's plenty of, all I did was I Googled a tutorial that told me how to put my own model up here, and you can do that as well. You might have noticed up here on the left side, you have this square, which is your silhouette of what you're working on. You can click on a corner and drag this out, and you can look at the silhouette. And I find that when I'm working on characters, a strong silhouette, it's really good to be able to check out my silhouette while I'm working. And this is fairly new. We used to have to just texture or put a black material on our character to see the silhouette, but now we have this, and this is pretty cool. All right, so back to just moving around in here. So like I said, I'm holding Alt, right-click, hovering above my tablet to do this, Control, right-click, moving my pen up and down, hovering above my tablet to do this, and then just touching my tablet out here in the canvas somewhere and rotate it. And what you'll find as you rotate it can be really, really difficult to if I want to see just this side of the cube facing me and I want the cube to be perfectly horizontal and vertical, it's really hard to do, right? So I'm just moving this around and it's really hard to position it exactly where I want it. However, there's a little trick. As I'm rotating this in whatever way that I want to move it, as I'm rotating it and I'm touching my canvas, I'm moving my pen, I'm touching my tablet and I'm moving my pen across it. As I rotate this, I'm going to hit my shift button. And when I hit it, whichever side of the cube is closest to me, it'll snap to that side. And this is a fast way to orient something. All right, so rotate this, hit shift, and it will snap just like that. Now, another way you can move stuff around, and some people prefer this way, is I could actually touch my pen to my tablet. And if I hold Alt and instead of hovering, I touch my pen to the tablet, I can pan around like this. And as my pen is still on the tablet, as I'm moving this around, I let go of Alt, it starts moving in and out. The trick here is you cannot lift your pen up while you're in the middle of that action. Hold Alt down, touch my pen to the tablet, move this around, do not lift my pen, but let go of the button, and then I can snap over into doing this. And you know what? I use this other method. I prefer hovering my pen and using Control and Alt and right click. It seems like it's extra, and maybe it is, I don't know. It's just the way I like to do it, but you will find sometimes when you're working in ZBrush that it's good to know multiple ways to do things, because every now and then it gets a little buggy and you might be doing one thing and it's just not happening. And you know it should happen, but it's not happening. And if you know a second way to do something or even a third way, it can come in handy. So there's two ways to move around in ZBrush. Hopefully that will help you. Now here's another thing. So I'm going to press W on my keyboard. And when I do, I get what we call the gizmo. Not sure what you call it anymore in Maya, the pivot or the, I don't know, maybe they call it a gizmo in Maya, I'm not sure. All right, but here you go. So right now I'm just moving this around in space myself. But if I needed to actually rotate this off of the origin or move it, because the model itself is sitting at the origin always. When you drag out a model, it doesn't matter where we think we are in space. If I haven't moved it, the cube is sitting dead center on the origin. But right here, I can grab the gizmo, and if I grab any one of these arrows, so the red is the x-axis. In fact, let me do this. Let me turn on over here. There's a floor button. All right, so if I turn that on, now we can kind of get an idea of where we are in space. And by looking at the floor, maybe you've noticed that I don't have any perspective right now. I am in an orthogonal view. And so that's definitely making the floor plane look kind of funny right now. So if I go right above that floor button, there's a perspective button. If I turn that on, now I have some perspective. Now, there are plenty of times that being in orthogonal is a good idea. There are reasons for that, the same as in Maya. But most of the time when you're sculpting on a character, it's probably a good idea to have perspective turned on, because you want to see what this thing is going to look like in 3D and what it would look like in another software. So now that I have this floor turned on, you can see what I'm doing. I'll grab this arrow right here and I can move this away from the center. So I'm moving along the x-axis. If I grab the green, I'm moving along the y-axis. If I grab the blue, I'm moving along the z-axis. Now, right now, this gizmo is attached to that cube and it's in the center of that cube. So right here, I have a little home icon. If I click that, that's going to put everything back in the center. So now my cube is back at the origin. Now, I can rotate this. So you see I've got these lines right here. I can rotate on any axis. All right, and I also can hit Control-Z and undo what I was doing there. And also if I kind of lose where I am, like I just did, I'm somewhere off screen, I can press F as in Frank to reframe the model. All right, so I was hitting Control-Z and I was undoing some of the moves I was making with the gizmo. look up here at the very top. See this orange dash right here? This is my history slider. So Control Z will undo something. Control Shift Z will redo it. Or I can go up here and I can just grab this slider and I can move up and down my history timeline right here. So Control Z, if you watch this dash, as I hit Control Z with my keyboard, you can see it going in one direction. When I hit Control Shift Z, you can see it going in the other direction, right? And if I take this all the way back, let's say to right here, you can see I have the redo history still in front of that little dash. But as soon as I do anything new, I will lose this history that I have right here, because this is a future that we haven't been to yet. If you watch any time travel movies there. Anyway, so as soon as I grab this and move it or something, you'll see that all of the little gray dashes that were on the right side of that are now gone. So we're creating a new timeline now. All right, so again, I can click the home icon right here, and that will put the cube back at the origin. Now, something else here to be aware of while we're talking about the gizmo here. Now, there's a bunch of icons here, and this gizmo does a lot of things, and I'm not going to get into all of them today because this is just a pre-quarter. This is a tour of how you get around in ZBrush so that you understand it when you walk into my classroom next week. So, okay. First, we know that we're perhaps oriented the right way because of this icon up here, right? So that little model of me is facing us. So theoretically, we're facing the front of the model. But even if we didn't have this over here to help us, we do have the gizmo. And if the gizmo is oriented, if it's been reset and it's oriented correctly, we should be able to look at the gizmo and know that our model is facing the right way. So we always want the blue axis right here to be coming out towards us, all right? And we want the red axis to be going left and right, and we want the green axis to be pointing upwards, okay? If we have that, then we know that this model is oriented correctly. Now, most of the time when you're sculpting in ZBrush, it really does not matter how the character or anything else you're sculpting, it doesn't matter how it's oriented. But you guys are going to be pipeline artists, or at least that's the assumption. And so you don't want to be that person who sends your character down the pipeline to some other artist working in Maya or some other software, and when they load up your character, it's upside down facing backwards, right? You don't want that. So this is how we can tell that everything is facing in the right way. Now, it can happen that the gizmo could have gotten oriented in some kind of weird way, like what I just did here. All right, now let me show you what I just did. Let me back it up a little bit. First of all, right now the gizmo is attached to that cube. If I want to move the gizmo around independently, there's a little padlock right here. And if I click on the padlock, it opens and I can move my gizmo independently. If I click on that padlock again, I can close it. There's another way I could do this. I could press Alt on my keyboard and just kind of hover over that padlock. And then I kind of like this method because I press Alt and I hover and the padlock opens and I move this. And then when I let go of everything, the padlock kind of closes by itself. I kind of like that method, but you know, you could do it either way. So now I have this out here, the gizmo, I'm going to hover, open the padlock again so I can move this around and reorient it. So now that I've done that, and if I close the padlock again, this becomes a new pivot, right, to move my model around. But let's say it just got oriented out here accidentally, and I want to get everything back oriented properly. I want to know what up and down is, and I want the gizmo back in the center of my model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the padlock, and then I've got this little curve arrow icon right here. If the padlock is open and I click that icon, then the gizmo is going to reorient. So now I know that all the axes are facing in the proper directions. And since that blue axis is pointing out towards me, I know that I'm facing the front of this model. Now I want to get the gizmo back into the center of the cube. So I'm going to open up the gizmo again, and I'm going to click this icon right here. So I click that, and the gizmo is back in the center. Other things I can do with that padlock open, when it's open, I can just touch anywhere on the model, and the gizmo is going to attach to that surface of the model, and it will always attach on the normal. All right, and so I've gotten it in some weird place, open up the padlock, click this icon, get it back in the center. Click this, reorient it, okay? Now, another thing though is right now it's putting it back in the center, and that's because right now I don't have any sculpting symmetry turned on. And by the way, just so I know that I said this, I pressed W earlier to turn the gizmo on. I pressed Q to turn the gizmo off. So W turns it on, and look what's happening up here. So W is move, Q is draw. I could also press R to rotate and E to scale. These are kind of throwbacks to an old way that we used to have to do things before we had a gizmo. Believe it or not, we did not have a gizmo for most of ZBrush's existence. We had something called a transpose tool. When I have the gizmo turned on, if I press Y on the keyboard, I will get the transpose tool. So this is a crazy tool. It does about 20 different things, and it depends on which one of these buttons are selected. So I could select rotate. I could grab one of these circles, like the inner circle, and move my pen left and right, and it will rotate on the axis that I established with the tool. It does a ton of other things. This thing is a deformer, all kinds of stuff. Google it, transpose tool. I'll press Y again to get back to my gizmo. Almost never will you use the transpose tool anymore, although if you know about it and you learn how to use it, it can get you out of a jam sometimes. But most of the time, you're going to use this gizmo. Now, like I said, you press W to turn it on, you press Q to turn it off. I'm going to press W and turn it back on here. And what I wanted to show you was, well, let me press Q and turn it off. Everything I was doing just then with the gizmo was without any sculpting symmetry turned on. And here's what I mean. If you go up here to the transform menu and you open this up, down here you have activate symmetry. So I can turn that on, and you'll see if let me get the front of this model facing me. See, I've got these two red dots. So now I'm actually will be sculpting with symmetry. And by the way, like the entire first half of the quarter until midterm, unless you have a very specific reason not to, you're going to sculpt your characters symmetrically, because it's going to save you a ton of time, right? So we want to do everything symmetrically, and right there in the transform tool, activate symmetry. If I want to work with X symmetry, I don't have to go in this menu and turn this on. I can just press X on my keyboard. When I press X on my keyboard, it turns symmetry on. Press X again, it turns symmetry off, all right? And so the reason I'm mentioning symmetry right now is if I press my gizmo and turn it back on, and I go back to this button right here to center my gizmo, when you click this and your symmetry is on, the gizmo doesn't go to the center, it goes to the center of 1/2. So it's going to center itself on 1/2 of this model. I hope that makes sense. So if you're ever trying to get your gizmo to the dead center of a model and it's just not happening for you, it's because your symmetry is turned on. So press X and then go up here and hit that button, and you can put it back in the center. All right. Now, another thing about this gizmo. So let me back this up a little bit. You've got this yellow square here in the middle. This is your scale. All right, so I can scale my model that way. You also have these little rectangular cubes on every one of these axes. So if I click on those and move, I can scale something just on one axis, like that right there. You also have this white circle and these white corners. So look, if I need to rotate my model, most of the time it's a good idea to use the axis. So if I want to rotate it around the Z axis, I'm going to grab the blue. If I want to rotate it around the X axis, I'll grab the red. Now, the reason this is a good idea to stick with these axes is because look right down here under this when I rotate it. You see it's counting the degrees that I'm rotating right there. And if I hold my shift button, it will snap in 5-degree increments. So let's say I rotate this and it says 60 degrees. All right, we rotated it 60 degrees, and then I go and I move around and I sculpt or I do something. And then I decide, you know what, I wish I had rotated that just a little bit more. I can go back and grab that same axis and then rotate it however many more degrees I think I should rotate it. But now this white circle is always facing the camera. It'll also rotate the model, but not on a specific axis. It's always facing the camera. So however my camera is oriented, it's going to rotate it based on where my camera is, where I am. So that could be anywhere, right? So let's say I rotated this 65 degrees, and then I go and I work and I'm doing something, and then I decide, man, I wish I had rotated that about 10 more degrees. I'm never going to get back to the exact place that I was the first time I rotated that, unless I saved out a camera, which you can do. I'm not going to get into that today. So the point is, yeah, you can use this to rotate something in a non-axis way. Just not usually a great idea if you ever think you might need to come back and make adjustments. All right, so, you know, I generally stick with the axes just in case I need to come back, but, you know, it's up to you. And you've got these white corners. So these white corners, basically, you can grab it and you can move your model in any direction you want to. Again, you need to be very careful with that. I don't know if it's ever happened to you guys in Maya, but like you grab a model with the pivot tool or the transform tool, whatever it's called. You grab it and you move your model over like what you think is 2 inches. But then when you rotate or orbit around the model, you realize that you've moved like way off in space somewhere. And that's just, you know, that happens because you're working in 3-dimensional space. That can happen with these corners as well. So yeah, these come in handy. You can move this around using those corners. The corners, just like the round circle, are always facing the camera. So I could turn it at a weird angle like this, grab a corner, and then move that over. And I've moved in a very weird direction from the origin. So that tool is available to you, but I would also just say use it wisely. Most of the time, it's probably a better idea to grab the axes and move something on an axis, but totally depends, totally up to you. All right, so that's moving stuff around. That's your gizmo, and this tool does a whole lot more, and we'll get into it a lot more as the quarter progresses. But again, this is just an introduction. I want you guys to have a basic knowledge of these tools before you walk in my classroom on the first day of class. All right, so we haven't really even talked about sculpting yet. We're talking about just moving stuff around, and now I think it'd be a good idea to kind of get into some of the sculpting tools and to show you what some of these buttons and things are around the canvas here. Okay, so first things first. Right now, I'm using a move brush. So just if I grab this right here, you can see that it just moves the surface of the model. And, you know, we've been looking at this for a long time with the wireframes on. If I'm tired of looking at wireframes, I can go down here and click the Poly F button. And by the way, anytime I hover over most buttons, not all of them, but most buttons, you can see it says Draw Polyframe and it says Shift F. It's telling you the hotkey for this button. So if I hit Shift F, I can turn off the wireframes, hit Shift F again. I can turn them on, off, and there you go. All right, so right now I'm using the move brush. Right up here, you can see it says move. This is telling me what brush I'm currently using. If I click on this, this opens up. So these are all of your available brushes. Actually, I take that back. These are nowhere near all of your brushes. If I press comma on my keyboard and go into my lightbox and click on brush right here, we have folders and folders and folders. I mean, there's thousands of brushes, but all of these are kind of little nuanced tweaks on the main brushes that are right here in the main brush menu. So now ZBrush is very intuitive. And once you learn how to do this, you'll see that life gets a lot easier for you. So I could go in here and I could click on the brush menu, and all of these brushes are in alphabetical order, and I could just start looking for a brush that I want. That can be pretty tedious. So let's say I want to use one of my favorite brushes that I like to use is called a clay buildup brush. I use it when I'm sculpting anatomy all the time. So A quicker way to get to a brush than what I was just doing by coming over here and clicking up here, I'm going to press B as in boy. And when I press B as in boy, my brush menu pops up here. So I've got the menu open. And now what we're going to do always takes three keystrokes. So I'm looking for my clay buildup brush. So the clay buildup brush starts with C. So my second keystroke will be C. All right. And this will isolate all the brushes to the C's. Now you can see that after I did my second keystroke, and we're only in the C's right now, every brush has a little kind of orange letter or number up in the corner. All right, now that little letter or that little number is your third keystroke. Now, what I'm about to tell you is not 100%, but it is about 95%. That normally, whatever the third keystroke is that pops in your brain, that's normally it. Like a brush like clay buildup. So we know that when we press, or rather, we know that it starts with C. So we hit B as in boy to bring up the menu. We hit C to get to the C's. The very next thing that pops in my brain when I think of clay buildup is B as in boy again. So the way, and that's usually the case. If I hit B to get the menu, C to get to the C's, and then clay buildup, I'm going to hit B again. Takes me to the clay buildup brush. This works most of the time. Now, every now and then it's a weird letter and you just have to memorize it. But like 95% of the time, it's exactly what you think it would be. Like I want to get back to the move brush again. I'm going to hit B to get to the menu. I'm going to hit M to get to the M's. Now, when I think of the move brush, the very next letter that pops in my brain is V as in victory, because that's the sound that the word makes, right? So if I hit B, M, V, I get my move brush again. So try that. When you're trying to find a brush, after you've learned actually some of the names of the brushes, start trying that and training your muscles to type in those three keystrokes and to start speeding up your workflow and getting to the brushes that you need to get to. All right, so yeah, let's do that. B, C, B. All right, so now I'm using a clay buildup brush. I have my symmetry turned on right now, and I'm gonna make a mark. But look at how low poly this mark is. So you can see that we are really, really low poly here. Now, probably you took this class, you know enough about it to know that you didn't, your goal to learn ZBrush was not because you wanted to work in low poly. You heard that we work in very high poly in ZBrush for sculpting details, and that's all true. But keep in mind, something people don't seem to realize as much is that all the box modeling that you do in Maya, all the low poly stuff, we can do that in ZBrush too. And I believe we can do it a lot faster than you can do it in Maya. And you can make your own choice. After this quarter, you're going to learn how to do low poly and high poly modeling in ZBrush. And you can decide for yourself if you think ZBrush is faster for low poly, not just high poly. But okay, let's get back to this. So I'm using a clay buildup brush and I'm making a mark, and boy, that just does not look exciting at all because we are very low poly. Now, if you look right up here, you'll see that we have active points and we have total points. So right now they are the same number, and here's one. I'm going to go back into this tool menu, and down here we have a subtool sub menu. So I'm going to click on that and open this up. Here is that cube that I'm working on. So your subtool menu in essence is like the outliner in Maya. So this is where all your parts will be. And over the course of working on a character, oh my gosh, you might have 100 at least subtools in here, maybe more. And so, man, you're just really going to pile this in. And so right now we only have one. In fact, let's add a few. Right down here in the subtool menu, you'll see append and insert. They both do exactly the same thing, only slightly differently. Let me show you. So if I click on append, this menu pops up. This is the menu that we saw earlier, right? So we've got 3D meshes. Maybe I'll add a helix. So I'll click on that, and now I have a helix in here. And notice that the helix is occupying the same space as that cube. So every time you bring in a mesh, it's going to be at the origin. So I'll do this again. I'm going to go to append. I'll grab this gear right here. So I'll bring that in. Now look, here's the difference between append and insert. Right now I have the cube selected. You can still see it inside there. and it's lit up because I have the polyframes turned on, right? So you can see that I have the cube selected. Every time I append something, I'll append this cone. When I append something, it's going to show up at the bottom of my stack, and I'll still have the cube selected. So whatever I had selected to begin with, I still have it selected, and whatever I picked in the append goes to the bottom of the stack. If I go to insert and I pick, let's pick this spiral. When I insert something, it shows up one step under whatever subtool I had selected. So I had the cube selected, the spiral shows up right below that cube. Not only that, automatically I now have the spiral selected, not the cube. Okay, so there's the difference. When I append something, it puts it at the bottom of the stack and I still have the original subtool selected. When I insert something, it puts it right below that subtool and it switches the thing that I have selected. Now I have the thing that I inserted selected. All right, so that's, and like I said, all these guys are sitting at the origin. And while we're over here, notice that I've got these little eye icons right here. So these icons are the visibility of all of these different subtools. And that's what they're called. All these little pieces are called subtools, which makes sense. Everything is labeled in kind of a hierarchical kind of way. Like I said, over here are files. These are all separate files that if I wanted to save everything in here, everything in the subtool menu, and this one is in this file. This file is called a ztool. All the pieces in that file are called a subtool. So it has a naming convention that's kind of hierarchical, okay? Like I said, all of these are separate files. So if I grab one of these, I'm back to only having one piece in the subtool menu. And that was the case with all of these guys. It was only this one file that I'm working on that we added more subtools into the subtool menu. And another thing here, so the more things that I bring over here into the ztool menu or the tool menu, this can get real messy. This can fill up pretty quickly and end up taking up this whole space over here in this tray, in this sidebar space over here. If I want to clean that up, I've got this R right here, and this will, it doesn't delete them, but it will clean all of these other models out of this space. So if I want to keep this one and be working on this one, I have it selected. And then I'll go right here and click this R, and that will clean out all that other stuff. Now that stuff is still in there. If I grab this little slider right here and I move it up and down, it will cycle through those other files that were in there. There's 52 files apparently in there, or it looks like it because it has that number 52, so I don't feel like scrolling through all those different things. Anyway, that's what happens there. So back over here in my subtool menu, these eye icons are the visibility. So if I want to turn the visibility of any of this other stuff off, I can do it by turning the little eye icon on and off. Now, I have the cube selected. And if I turn the visibility of it off, it doesn't matter because anything that you have selected, it will by default be visible. If I switch over to a different subtool, but have the visibility of other things turned off, I will only see the subtool that I select. Now, if I have this cube selected and I want to turn the visibility of everything else on or off in one click, I can hold Shift, I can click the eye icon of the subtool I have selected, and I can turn everything on or everything off all at once. Now, another thing here, I was talking about history. One thing to learn about ZBrush that is very different from Maya and honestly most other software that I know of, every single subtool over here has its own history. In fact, every subtool has its own almost everything. There are not a lot of global settings in ZBrush. Most things are isolated to each subtool. In some cases, I suppose that could be a little tedious, but actually it gives you, it makes things a lot easier in the bigger picture. Like, think about it this way. Have you ever been working on something in Maya? And let's say you have several, let's say I were working on something in Maya like this helix, right? And I did something to it. And then I went off and I worked on this a little bit. And then I came over here and worked on this. And eventually I got to a place where I was like, you know what? like 50 moves ago, I wish I hadn't done that to that helix. I need to fix that. If I were working in Maya, I would have to undo everything that I had done after I did this to the helix, right? And so basically everything else that I worked on, I would have to undo all those things to get to this moment where I did this to the helix. Not the case in ZBrush. I can simply click on the helix. It has its own history. So I can undo that to the helix and then go back to every other subtool, and I didn't mess up anything I did to those because everything has their own individual histories. So going back to the cube, I can undo it and only it. All right, so I think that's really useful in ZBrush. All right, a long time ago, before I went off on this little tangent here, we were using the clay buildup brush, and I was making marks on this, and we were talking about the fact that, or we were talking about active points and total points. I added a whole bunch of things over here in the subtool menu so you could actually see something. Active points. You can think of points like polys, even though points is exactly what you think it is. It's every vert on this model. So this low poly model has 218 verts or points, okay? Now on most normal wireframe meshes, points and polys are pretty close to the same number. So I could, without being too inaccurate, I could say 218 polys, I could say 218 points, and I would be pretty accurate either way, unless I had a very unusual wireframe on my model. Now, so right now, active points, these are all the verts on this cube. Total points are all of the verts combined of all of the models that I have in my subtool menu over here. As you guys probably know by now, when you're working in animation and games and all of this, poly count is a pretty big deal. And you generally need to kind of know what your poly count is. And so this helps us know what our poly count is going to be. So I can always look up here and refer to this. Now, you can also predict things. So I've got 218 poly. Well, you know what? Let me put a pause on that for a second. Let me show you this first. So when I make a mark with my clay buildup brush on this low poly mesh, it just looks terrible, right? Looks very low poly. Now, the whole reason I'm working in ZBrush is because I want to work in high poly. So I closed the subtool menu and I opened up the menu right below it, geometry. All right, inside geometry, there's this button that says divide. And you can see when I hover over it that the hotkey for that is Control D as in dog. All right. So if I want to get this model to be higher resolution, I can click this button, or what I suggest you guys start practicing and start learning to do is using your hotkey. So I'm going to hit Control D, and I have now subdivided this model one time. So look at my poly count right here. It went from 218 to 866. Now, how did that number come about? I want you to look at the wireframe. Back this up. So look at this one quad right here. When I subdivide a model, I am bisecting it vertically and I am bisecting it horizontally. So when I subdivide it, one quad becomes 4 quads. All right, so you can see this right here. Now, so you can predict that, you know, and you don't have to be a perfect mathematician. I can just see that, okay, this is roughly 200 points. I want to know what it's going to be when I subdivide it. 2 times 4 is 8. And so I know that it's going to be roughly 800 something polys. You might also notice too that the corners of this cube got rounded. If I'm creating, if I'm working on something organic, which is most of the time, well, a lot of the time what you're doing in ZBrush, like a character or a creature or something, and that's what you want it to do. You want it to get round and have an organic look to it. By default, right over here next to this divide button is a smooth button. It is on by default. All right, so when you subdivide something, it's going to round it out. If I'm ever working on something that I intended to be hard surface and I want to keep these sharp corners, but I do want it to be higher resolution, all I got to do is turn this smooth button off. And now when I subdivide this, you can see it's higher resolution, but it looks exactly the same, right? So all has to do with that smoothing algorithm that's in that button right there. Also, sometimes you might, decide I do want rounded corners, but I don't want them to be, let me back this up. I don't want it to be that big of a rounded corner. So what you can do is turn smooth off, subdivide it a couple of times, then turn it back on. So, you have way smaller polys now. And so when you do the next subdivision, you're going to get a much smaller bevel right there. So, there's little tricks there to do what it is that you want to do. All right, so back to this subdivision. You might have noticed that when I hit Control D and I subdivide this one time, this right here that was grayed out, now it has this little slider here. So what this is these are my subdivision levels. So if I turn this back down to 1, I'm back to my original poly count. If I bump this up to 2, I'm back to my new poly count. You might also notice when I bump this up to 2, I still have big polys right here, even though I know it's subdivided one time. If you want to update what the wireframe actually looks like, turn the polyframes button off, turn it back on. Now you can see the smaller squares. If I subdivide this one time, I didn't see the polyframe do that. Turn it off, turn it back on. Now I can see the smaller quads. So if anytime you want the wireframe to update whatever you're doing when you subdivide it, just turn it off, turn it back on, and you'll see the updated subdivided wireframe. All right, so right now I've got 3 subdivisions here. You might also notice that even though I turn this back to 1, which is the lowest subdivision, I can't get back to the original shape of that cube. If you've ever used the soften button in Maya, if you go to mesh display, there's a button called soften, which kind of averages the normals. We are basically softening the normals on this. So you cannot get back to your original, well, I shouldn't say that. There are ways to get back to the original mesh, but without knowing a lot about ZBrush, when you go back to the lowest subdivision, it's going to be a little bit deformed because you've done that by subdividing. All right, so Control D activates that subdivision button. If I hit if I hit D as in dog, look at my slider right here. D goes up the slider, Shift D goes down the slider. So for me, ZBrush has so many different menus. It's just such a good habit, I've said this before, to start learning hotkeys, because I don't always want to have to go over here and open this menu up and grab this slider and move it up and down to go up and down my subdivision levels. Instead, I can just press D a couple of times or Shift D a couple of times, and I can move this up and down. Now, I'm at 3,400 polys right now, and for the most part, this is still low poly. I mean, you can sort of see a little more resolution on that clay buildup brush that we started with, but I mean, this is nothing to ZBrush. This is still, in ZBrush terms, still low poly. So I'm going to hit Control D several more times. Look at my number right here, 13,000, 55,000, 221,000, just under 1 million now, 800,000. And look at that. That's what that brush is supposed to look like, clay buildup. And if I zoom in, you can still see it's kind of low poly. So maybe I want to subdivide it one more time. I'll hit Control D. Now I'm at 3.5 million polys. So now when I come in here with this brush, that's what that brush looks like. All right, now look at how many subdivisions I have right here. So there will be times, and I want to make sure that you guys understand this. And I'm going to say this a lot when we're in class and we're working. You don't always want to subdivide a model up to the highest resolution and start sculpting. There are times when you want something to be low poly. There are times when you want it to be high poly. And because you might want to switch back and forth between those two things, it's a good idea to have subdivisions right here. Now, you'll find as we begin to work that there are things that we do in ZBrush that will make these subdivisions go away. And then there are processes that you have to go back through and do to get them back. It's a good idea always to have subdivisions right here. It gives you more flexibility. Now, there are reasons why I might want to be in low poly and sometimes reasons why I might want to be in high poly. Obviously, I want to be in high poly because I want to see the great details that that brush has, right? But maybe I'm using a move brush, and if I use a move brush, that can get really pointy right there. Or the higher res I am, the more I use a move brush, the more lumpy my mesh gets. Like you can see how lumpy that is. If I want to move a little piece of this model without it getting so lumpy, it's a good idea to bump down to low poly. And then I can move this right here, bump back up to high poly. And you see that I created this deformation, but it's not lumpy. Another thing is when I'm sitting at 3.5 million polys, it makes it harder to smooth it out. The higher res something is, the harder it is to smooth. And let me show you what smooth is, by the way. So I'm gonna make a mark with that clay buildup. It does not matter what brush you're using. If you press Shift on your keyboard, look over here. When you press Shift, it's smooth. So by default, you have that smooth, by the way, is just a brush, and there are different types of smooth brushes. But by default, you have the basic smooth brush attached to the Shift button. So if I press Shift and I go to smooth this, so I'm just sort of painting on the mesh while holding Shift on my keyboard, you can see that I can smooth that out. Now, when I'm sitting at 3 million polys, I can't really smooth this all the way. I can still see some of that mark. But if I bump this down to really low poly, I can smooth that whole thing out really fast and then bump it up to a higher res and smooth it out even more. So see how fast I can smooth something out when I'm at a lower res. Now you'll still see a little hint of those marks when I bump it back up to high res, but it's just easier to smooth things when you're in lower res. And so kind of a workflow you'll get used to doing is smoothing something on a lower subdivision and then having to smooth it on every subdivision as you work your way back up. So I'll press D, bump it up to 5, smooth it, press D again, bump it up to 6, smooth it, press D, bump it up to 7, smooth it. And by the time I get up to the highest resolution, I have smoothed that completely out. I know that looks kind of tedious, and guess what? It kind of is. But it's just part of the process, okay? Now, something else, let me back up my history a little bit. By the way, one of the reasons I like this clay buildup brush, I like it when I'm working on anatomy. And because I like these ridges that are in this brush. They're really good to me for kind of looking like the striations that a muscle group has if I'm trying to do a character that's really ripped. So let's pretend for a second that I'm doing like the deltoids on a character. Maybe I'm doing the shoulder muscles of a character. So I might come in like this and just kind of carry my brush strokes in the direction that I know the muscles go. And then I'll press Shift and I'll come back and I'll smooth this out just a little bit. So I don't smooth it all the way. I leave a little bit of those striations there. And so it helps to create kind of ripped muscles on a character. So that's one reason that I really like that brush. All right, but let's back up. I want to explore some things that are happening with this brush right now. So this clay buildup brush has these kind of ridges on it, and it has a very kind of square shape to it. There are two things that's powering the shape of that brush. Actually, let me switch over real quick to a standard brush just to show you the difference. So this is a standard brush. This is as basic as a brush gets, all right? If I do two little adjustments to the standard brush, I will get this clay buildup brush. And here's what the adjustments are. So right up here at the top, we've got focal shift. In fact, let's back up a little bit. Let's look at everything here. I promise I'll come back to what I was just talking about just in 90 seconds. So up here you have Z add and Z subtract. So when I add clay to something, or when I make a mark, I'm adding clay. And so that's Z add. If I switch to Z subtract, I'm subtracting clay. See that? All right, so I also am getting a certain intensity with my marks. Now, you guys should have a Cintiq or a tablet of some kind that has pressure sensitivity. So the harder I press with my pen, the stronger or lighter my mark is going to be. I also have Z intensity right here. So I have two ways of controlling how strong the mark is that I'm making. Let me back this up a little bit. All right, so I can crank up the Z intensity right here, and I'll get a really strong mark. I can also just press even harder on my tablet and get an even stronger mark. So how hard you press with your pen and controlling this intensity right here controls how heavy your mark is. Z add adds clay, and Z subtract subtracts clay. there's also the Alt key on your keyboard. So think of Alt as kind of the opposite of almost everything you do in ZBrush. If I'm using Z add and I'm adding clay and I don't feel like going up here and clicking Z subtract, I can just press Alt on my keyboard and I can subtract. In the same way, I could already have this on Z subtract and be subtracting clay, but just press Alt and I can add clay. So Alt is the opposite of everything almost that you do in ZBrush. Then I get over here to, I have draw size and I have focal shift. So draw size, that is the size of my brush. It's what you think it is. So if I adjust this, I'm making my brush bigger or smaller. Now look at my brush. There's an outer red circle and there's an inner red circle. So the outer red circle is the size of my brush, right? So I make a mark, it's that size. The inner circle is the tip of my brush. And the tip of my brush is focal shift right up here. So focal shift by default on the standard brush is at 0. And any brush that hasn't been altered, which by default kind of would be the standard brush, has a focal shift of 0. But now the focal shift goes to -100 and it goes to +100. Look at the inner circle of my brush as I move this. So if I take this down to -90 or -100, you can see that that inner circle is going out towards the outer circle. And if I bring it up into a positive number, it gets way smaller. So if I want a brush that has a really pointy tip, I'm going to take it up to the smaller, I'm going to make that circle much smaller. If I want a broader, wider kind of fan-shaped flat brush, I'm going to go into the negatives and make that inner circle almost touch my outer circle. So I brought up the clay buildup brush, and let me put this back at 0. So I wanted to compare the standard brush, and then if I switch over to my clay buildup, the clay buildup brush. So the standard brush has a focal shift of 0. It's been unaltered. If I switch over to a clay buildup brush, look at this. My focal shift is 56. So, or I'm sorry, -56. So by taking this into the negative numbers, I'm getting a flatter, wider, more kind of square shape. Well, not square shape, but flatter brush. And that's part of what's creating the shape of this clay buildup brush. One other thing is right here, something called an alpha. An alpha is a lot like a stencil. In fact, that's pretty well what it is. If I switch over to my standard brush, you see that it does not have an alpha. All right. If I go back to my clay buildup brush, it has this square alpha. So the two things powering this brush are the -56 focal shift and that square alpha. So when I make a mark, those two adjustments to this brush turn a standard brush, which makes this mark right here, standard brush, become a clay buildup brush. So those are two things right off the bat that if you learn about ZBrush, the focal shift and the alphas over here, you can create almost any type of brush you want. And if I click on this menu right here, the alpha menu, you'll see that by default in ZBrush, there are a number of alphas, just these stencils. So if I click on a different one, I'm going to get a different mark on that brush. I could also go right here. So here's my brush. Here's my alpha. In between is something called the stroke. Most brushes that you use will have a dots, or right now we're using a freehand stroke. These two strokes are hard to distinguish the difference. If I pick dots, looks like that. If I pick freehand, looks like that. Kind of looks about the same. And honestly, they really are almost exactly the same. But if I wanted to see the shape of this alpha right here on my model, I could switch this over to drag rectangle, and this will just drag out that alpha. And how strong that alpha is showing up, well, that's based on my intensity here. So I could drag that out, turn up my intensity, get that to look a lot stronger. I could switch it to Z subtract and make it go inwards. All right, so let's switch that back to dots. So there's your brush, your stroke, and your alpha. And since I don't want to ruin this clay buildup brush, I'm going to go back to the alpha that it had, and I'm going to give it a square again. Or if for some reason you're messing with a brush and you've just messed it up so much and you don't know how to get back to where it was, then you can go right here. You can open up your brush menu, go down here. It says reset all brushes. You click that and it resets all the brushes back to their defaults and gets them back to where you want them to be. All right, there's just a couple of more things I want to show you in this lecture so you'll be prepared for day one of class. One is something called masks. So right here, I told you that I always keep my left hand, and if you're left-handed, it would be your right hand, but I keep my left hand on the Alt, the Control, and the Shift buttons at all times. So I just have my 3 fingers on those 3 buttons. You have something called masks. So right here where the brush menu is, if I press Control, it changes that menu. And now if I click on it, it becomes a mask menu. So I have all these different masks. There's mask rectangle, so I can have a rectangular mask. There is mask lasso, which I use a whole lot. So you can pretty much make any shape you want, or you have a mask pen, so you could paint on a mask, and there's several other shapes. Okay, so let me show you what a mask is. So I'll just grab the mask lasso. So if I mask out some of this, and I have my symmetry turned on, so whatever I do to the right side, it's doing to the left side. When I have a mask on here and I go to sculpt or move something around, anything that has a mask on it will not be affected. All right, so that's the whole point of a mask, is to just kind of protect certain areas of my model. It comes in really, really handy. Now, here's how you use a mask. So I'm going to hold Control. When I hold Control, that activates that menu. Now, I might need to go in and select a specific mask. If I have already selected the type of mask that I would use, then all I need to do is press Control, and then I'm going to take my pen and touch my tablet, and I can draw that mask out. All right, so Control activates it, touch my tablet, draw a mask. I mentioned earlier that Alt is the opposite of almost everything. So maybe I've drawn on a mask, but I want to get rid of part of this mask. I'll hold Control to activate the mask, and I'll also hold Alt. So right now I'm holding Control Alt, and that gives me a white mask. And that goes in and subtracts whatever part of the mask that I was using right there, right? So Control does a mask, Control Alt can subtract part of that mask. Another thing here is when I've drawn a mask, I can hold Control and I can just tap my pen to my tablet, just tap the canvas. And when I do that, it reverses the mask. So Control, tap, and reverse, all right? Or if I want to just get rid of the whole mask, I'm going to hold Control and I'll draw another mask just somewhere out here in the canvas. I think of it more as not drawing a mask, but just dragging. If I hold Control and drag, I can get rid of that. So Control, do a mask, Control Alt, get rid of part of that mask, Control tap, reverse it, Control drag, get rid of it. All right, so that's a mask. Here's another thing. Control Shift gives us a third menu right up here where the brush menu is. So Control is the mask, Control Shift is the selection menu. So now if I click on this and open it up, you'll see that I have a completely different set of tools. Now, some of these I'm not going to get into today. Some of these over here on the right side, we have slice, trim, there's a knife, and let's see, slice, trim, oh, and over here is a clip. All of these are very similar, and I'll talk about them when we're in class. So clip, knife, slice, and trim. We'll get into those another day. What I want to talk about is just right here. We have select lasso and select rectangle, you know, whichever one you want to use. I'm going to go with the lasso. So I'm going to select that. And now when I press Control Shift, watch this box right here. When I press Control Shift, it activates that lasso selection tool that I already selected. So while I'm still holding Control Shift, this works a lot like the masks. I'm going to draw out a lasso, and you'll see that I have this green lasso. And whatever I select, it's going to isolate that. So you see in the middle here, it's gone right now. It's not deleted. It's just hidden. All right. So what I can do, and I mentioned again, Alt is the opposite of everything. So Control Shift gives me a green selection tool. All right. Control Shift Alt gives me a red selection tool. And this does the opposite. Instead of selecting something, it hides something. All right, so Control Shift, let me undo this and get back to where I was. Control Shift selects, Control Shift Alt hides. All right, now this works almost the same as a mask, but the opposite. This is kind of silly to me, but you'll see what I mean here in a second. Control Shift select. If I want to reverse my selection, I'm going to hold Control Shift and I'm going to drag and it reverses. When you were doing the mask, it was Control Shift, or I'm sorry, it was you tap the canvas and you would drag to get rid of your mask. And when you're doing the selection tool, it's just the opposite. Control Shift drag will reverse what I have selected. Control Shift tap brings it all back. So Control Shift select something, Control Shift drag, reverse it, Control Shift tap, bring it all back. All right, so those are your selection tools. One other thing, you noticed when I hid something, when I rotate this around, you can't see anything on the inside there. So, and it looks like it disappears. So in ZBrush, by default, you can't see the back faces of something. And I guess this is a way to save memory or something, but it can be pretty annoying. If you want to be able to see the inside of this model, go over here to your menu, scroll all the way down near the bottom, you'll see display properties right here. Click on that. And right here is this button that says double. Turn on double, and now you can see the back faces. There's a flip button right here too. And this is, in Maya, that would be the reverse normals. In ZBrush, you flip the normals. So like, let me turn that off. You can't see the back faces. If I flip it, now it's the opposite. I can't see the front faces. So I'll flip it again. And it's taking its sweet time. Let's try that again. There we go. And if I want to see the front and the back faces, I'm going to turn on double, and now I can see both of them. Control Shift tap, bring everything back. All right. So we've talked about your subtool menu and some things that go on here. We've talked about how you subdivide your model and how you move up and down the subdivision levels. We've talked about your focal shift, your draw size, your Z add and Z subtract, and the intensity, and 3 different menus over here, your stroke right here, and your alphas right here. So we've covered a whole bunch, and I want you to know these things when you come into class, because on day 1 of class, I'm going to start sculpting. All right, and I want you guys to kind of be there with me and know what I'm doing. All right, so one other thing. Well, 2 things. One thing is between now and the beginning of class, it's a good idea to come in here and just start messing around. All right, so, start trying out all of these brushes. Just pick one, see what it does. Try to break ZBrush. Here's a fair warning. ZBrush will crash on you a whole bunch. Well, not a whole bunch, but it will crash on you. Now, ZBrush has multiple ways for saving your work. If I press comma and I go back into the light box, right here is quick save. So quick save will save, this is like an auto save. All right, so in the preferences, if I go down here to, let's see, where are you? Quick save. So right in here, you can tell it how often to save your work. So right here, 20 minutes, when it rests for 1 minute. If I don't do anything for 1 minute, it will save my work. If I'm working, it will every 20 minutes save my work. All right. I generally don't like an autosave. I like to save it myself because it never fails. The autosave will come on when you're in the middle of something, and then you have to wait. If you have a very heavy file, sometimes you'll have to wait 5 minutes for it to finish saving. And that can really be annoying if you're really in the middle of some serious work. So if you don't want it to autosave, you can drag these guys right here all the way to 600. It will autosave, but it won't do it it will do it every 600 minutes. So in effect, you are basically turning off your quick save. All right, if ZBrush ever crashes on you, and it will, most of the time a little box will come up that says something to the effect of ZBrush is about to close, but it's going to try to save your work first. When that happens, the next time you open ZBrush, go into the lightbox, go to quick save right here, and you will find your work sitting here in the quick save. Every now and then it will crash and not save it. So I wouldn't rely on that 100%. All right, which brings us to saving your work. Right here in the tool menu, you have a save as. All right, there are 3 different ways to save your work in ZBrush that I know of. And in fact, there's other ways too. This is the way you want to do it. Okay, just trust me on this. You might Google this one day. How do you save things in ZBrush? And you might come across a different way to do this. But for us, for what we're doing, and for the benefit of having way smaller file sizes, you want to do it here. Go into the tool menu, go to save as, click on this, and you will save your file as a .ztl file. That's a ztool. All right, that's what you want. All right, now look, just for the sake of letting you know, right up here in File, there's a Save As. This saves what's called a ZPR, a Z project. This saves a lot more things. For example, earlier in this lecture, I was showing you over here multiple files, like there was 5 or 6 different files. A Z project saves all of those files in one project, which can just really balloon your file size. It can, you know, you can easily have a 10 gig file that you're saving, and you don't want to do that. It's best to just save one file at a time, I think. And so I just save the one file that I'm working on. Sometimes there's lots of junk files over here that I don't even need and I don't even care about. So I'm going to save as a Z tool with this save as. All right. And that's what you want to do. And it will save only the one that you have selected. Okay. So just be aware of that. All the other ones, if you didn't save them, they're going to get lost. Unless you save a project, which I don't recommend. Now, one last thing about saving, and there are some Google tutorials out there that will tell you the wrong thing. Over here under document, there's a save as and a save. You don't ever want to use this, okay? Like I said, this ZBrush started out as a painting software, and this document, if you do a save as, you're going to save a really pretty picture of what you've been working on. Like what you see in my canvas right here, it's going to save this picture. It's not saving your actual model, just a picture of your model. So don't ever, I mean, well, if you need to get a screenshot or something, okay, that's fine. But if you're trying to save the model that you're working on, do not do it under document. And I recommend don't do it under file. And by the way, you're going to be turning in your files to me at various times during the quarter. I don't ever want this right here, a ZPR, a Z project. I never want that. One thing about Z projects, if I have my own Z tools over here that I'm working on, or you'll be working on something and you want to load another file, if you load a Z project, a ZPR, it loads it on top of the other stuff you have over. It gets rid of the stuff you're already working on and replaces it. So if I have a file I'm working on and I want to work on a different one too at the same time, it gets rid of the first one. And so I never want that. If you guys ever turn in a Z project, like I'm going to do critiques for you guys throughout the quarter, and I might be critiquing multiple students at one time. And if you hand me a ZPR and I load it, it's going to get rid of the other students that I'm critiquing. And so never ever turn in a ZPR to me. Always turn in a Z tool. And that's the best file. It's the best practice of what you want to save as anyway. All right. So that's just kind of a tour. Oh, one other thing I just thought of. I don't know if I did this throughout my lecture today. I tried not to actually. See this right here? So I'm pressing spacebar. I mentioned that there are multiple ways to do things in ZBrush. There's usually at least 3 things to do everything. 3 ways to do everything. So when I press spacebar, all the stuff right here that's around your canvas, it's all right here. So if I want to change from Z add to Z subtract or adjust my intensity or my draw size, Lots of times when I'm working, I press space bar. All of that stuff is right here. All right, so that's just faster. It's going to pop up wherever my cursor is. All right, so that's a really speedy way to adjust things without having to go up here and adjust things. Another thing is there's way other hotkeys. So like, let's say I want to adjust the brush size. I could go up here and adjust it, or I could press space bar and I could go right here and adjust it, or I could press S on my keyboard and I could adjust it this way. All right, so there's multiple ways to do everything, and you guys are going to learn that. But the space bar, that's probably what you're going to start with, and that's going to come in handy. So let me just show you that right before I end this. All right, so guys, I'm going to post this. You will find this in Blackboard. So if you're watching this, you already found it.